Hey there, and welcome into University of Hoops, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of your favorite basketball team. I'm Blake Atwell, and today we are very excited to welcome from The Athletic national NBA reporter Fred Katz. Fred, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Really excited to have a fellow media content creator on the show. We've had up to this point lots of coaches, lots of scouts, front office people, but to have again a fellow media member on the show with me today is super exciting. So excited to get into what your journey has been like on this side of it, because for all the people out there that go the coaching route, there's tenfold people that are trying to be writers and trying to cover the NBA and trying to do all sorts of multimedia stuff. So excited to get into all of it. Want to start by just congratulating you on your recent promotion at the Athletic.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
been a fun ride. It was fun to be on the Knicks beat. This next one will be fun. I get paid to watch basketball. There are a lot of people who have it worse off than me.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely worse things you could be doing and living a lot of people's dreams by having that kind of job. Also, know how stressful that can be and how interesting it is to build those relationships along the way and put yourself in a position where you can elevate like you have to a national level. I guess for our viewers and our listeners out there that, are familiar with your work as a beat writer and covering one team, what are some of the main differences that you can share about what your job is going to be like now at the national level?
I mean, in some ways, it's going to be very similar in that when I was a beat writer, I really just took, you know how like songwriters, musicians will say, just write what makes you happy. I basically just did that as a beat writer. And so there'd be times where I'd want to write a story and I'd be like, this is for no one but me. But sometimes when you write the stories that are for no one but you, your enthusiasm shines through and people just pick up on it because they see how enthusiastic you are through your words or through the way that you describe things, through the your diligence in pursuing that story. Maybe the people you're interviewing for that story pick up on your enthusiasm. So they respond with either phenomenal detail, phenomenal stories, phenomenal energy on their end, because good energy also often wants to meet good energy. And from that sense, I'm still doing the same stuff. I'm going to write what I think is interesting, but it's just on a grander scale. Whereas when I was covering the Knicks, I was writing what I think is interesting about the Knicks. Sometimes it's a feature story on Julius Randle. Sometimes it's a deep dive into something really nerdy, X's and O's wise or stats wise, analysis on cap or whatever else. Sometimes it is going to be just here's a great anecdote that I heard about Josh Hart and Tom Thibodeau and how they've been ribbing each other for the entire season. And I'm going to take that approach and just bring it to the national sphere. So instead of just doing that stuff on the Knicks, or my previous beat was the Wizards, instead of just doing it on those teams, then I'm going to do it now on the whole league, and I'm just going to kind of try to be in search for whatever I find to be interesting. Could be a basketball angle, could be a human angle. It could be anything. If it's interesting, I'm into it.
Brett, after several years on that Knicks beat, I got to ask you, what are some of your favorite Knicks stories from your time being that tuned in with the team?
Ones that I wrote.
Yeah. And favorite stories, favorite moments, just things that you look back on and you're like, man, that was fun. That was cool.
Yeah, I mean, like covering playoff games at MSG in that environment is really really fun. MSG in the playoffs is just rocking, and to be there kind of when the organization turned things around, to be able to chronicle that was very enjoyable. In terms of favorite things that I actually wrote while I was on the beat, I wrote a feature about Tom Thibodeau, kind of how his reputation says that he wears on his players. And that was his rep coming into New York. It was his rep a lot of the time he was in New York, and kind of why he hasn't worn on this Knicks team. And it's all these very specific reasons as to why he hasn't worn on Josh Hart, why he hasn't worn on Dante DiVincenzo. And the reason I like that story in part because Josh Hart was completely and utterly off the rails for that story, just unhinged and uninhibited in his interview, giving anecdotes and cursing and everything else and saying the most inappropriate stuff you could possibly put in print. I think if he said something slightly more inappropriate, I would have just not been able to run the quote at all. And aside from all of that, I think the reason that I liked that story is because that was like a sweat equity story. Like that's not a story that I could just parachute in on. and do. It was something that I built up trust with all these people so they felt comfortable taking me behind the scenes on things. A lot of it was based on things I heard throughout the year. And when you hear them individually, it's like that's not really a story. But when you start to hear themes build up, you start tying things together and you're like, oh, this thing keeps happening. That's very interesting. And I liked how representative that was of that sort of process. Um, I wrote a really silly story about at one point about Mitchell Robinson's obsession with making the same dick joke over and over again for an entire season. And I wrote an incredibly silly story about that at one point. That was really fun and funny. And I don't know, there's probably a lot of them. There's probably a lot of stuff that I've written. I've been like, that could be way better. Because if I ever go back and read my stories, I'm always like editing as I read it. I'm like, that should have been there. I should have led with that. Should have cut that word. Should have cut that line. Should have moved this graph here. Like I'm always hypercritical of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and speaking of the things that you learn by writing those stories, I mean, in this last job, being in New York, the media market that it is, what are some of the biggest things that you learned that were different from the prior stops in your career that you think are going to help you really be able to take full advantage of being a national writer?
I mean, doing it on a larger platform is something. Sometimes I think it's a little overstated, to be honest, because ultimately you're still doing the same job and you still have to do it in a similar sort of way. But a beat writer has to understand his or her fan base. You gotta understand who you're writing for and what those people are like and how they act and what their culture is like and what their community is like. And if you're covering, let's say, the Yankees in New York, you're probably going to have a little bit of a different tone than if you're covering the Knicks. Because if you're covering a Knicks team that, say, we're covering the Knicks team from a couple years ago, that was a 5 seed, and they win a playoff series, and they lose to Miami as an 8 seed in the second round. You're covering that, and fans are happy. The organization's happy. It's a step forward from where they'd been the last 20 years, and culture's good. Brunson had Brunson was a total game changer his first year in New York, and obviously even more his second year. And you're going to reflect that tone. Whereas if you're covering the Yankees and the Yankees have the fifth best record in the American League, and they lose in the ALDS to a team that they were higher seeded then like Yankee fans are going to be in a tizzy. They'll start tearing down Yankee Stadium brick by brick. It will be a maniac because they expect a championship every single year and they expect a championship every day, even though there's a championship only once a year. And it'll be May and they'll be like, why haven't they won the title yet? I don't understand. And so you kind of have to reflect upon your fan base in some ways. And that doesn't mean changing who you are. And it doesn't mean setting either ultra fair or it doesn't mean like going too easy on someone, and it doesn't mean going too hard on someone just because the fans might be super passionate. And it's not the Yankee fans are more passionate than Knicks fans. It's not the case. They're basically the same people for the most part. It's just that expectations set a different sort of reaction, right? And with the Yankees, they have that history that changes the expectations. And I think being around the league, being around different fan bases, I covered the Oklahoma City Thunder. I covered the Washington Wizards. It's like all these different types of behaviors, different types of behaviors with organizations too. The Knicks operate very differently from the Wizards teams that I covered. And the Wizards teams that I covered operated very differently from Sam Presti's Thunder when I covered them. And you learn about things that work in the league, things that don't work in the league, coaching approaches, different ways to approach different people as a reporter, whether those are front office people or coaches or players or people who just don't work on the basketball side at all. Like you just kind of learn, you build up your institutional knowledge. And I kind of think every year on the beat should be looked at as a learning experience and an opportunity to get better.
Fred, you mentioned some of your prior stops there, so I'd love to get into that now. Take our viewers and our listeners back to the beginning. How'd you get into journalism, and take us through your career journey to get to where you are today?
Yeah. So I graduated from University of Missouri, 11 years ago, and just started freelancing. And I originally wanted to be a play-by-play guy. That was like kind of what I wanted to do all while growing up. I knew I wanted to be a sports reporter. I knew I wanted to be in some sort of sports media. I wanted to do play by play. I started doing beat writing when I was in college as well, along with play by play. And the NBA writing jobs kind of just came before any sort of good play by play job did, even though I was applying for both. And I latched on with Bleacher Report a little bit. I latched on with foxsports.com a little bit. And then I was just freelancing to whoever would give me like a fraction of a penny in order to write. Eventually, I got laid off by Bleacher Report, or they didn't renew me. Laid off by foxsports.com. They didn't renew me. And I applied for a job with the Norman Transcript in Oklahoma. And, you know, at the time, like you get laid off by foxsports.com and you're like 26 years old and everybody in this business gets laid off. It just is, it's part of everybody's story. But when it happens to you and you're in that time, you're like, well, being part of everyone's story doesn't exactly, I can't tell that to my landlord, you know? You'd be like, no, don't worry. Just don't charge me this month. They said it was part of everyone's story. Landlord's going to be like, okay, cool. So I applied for his job in Oklahoma, covering the Thunder for the Norman Transcript, which is a small newspaper in Norman, Oklahoma, and a newspaper I had never heard of until I saw the job listing. Newspaper that I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have never heard of. And it ended up being the best professional decision of my career when I got it and decided to move to Oklahoma on 4 days' notice, a place I had never been, and just jumped right into that beat. And that paper was incredible. I had the most incredible editor. I was so lucky because a small paper, you don't quite know what you're going to get. I had the most incredible editor in chief, this guy named Caleb Slinkard, just unbelievable. The paper was extremely committed to the Thunder beat. I was traveling to essentially every road game, and then it kind of took off from there. I ended up leaving there after a couple of years. I got a job covering the Boston Celtics for MassLive.com, which I was at for very, very shortly because I got another offer right after from The Athletic, and it was a tough decision. I felt terrible leaving Mass Live right after I got there, but I kind of Bill Belichicked MassLive.com. Well, I shouldn't say Bill Belichick. That's too cocky. I'm not Bill Belichick, but you know what I mean. I'm a Jets fan, so that to me is Bill Belichicking. But I left Mass Live very shortly after I got there. I never covered a game as a Celtics beat reporter and moved down to DC to cover the Wizards for The Athletic. And after 3 years doing the Wizards, The Athletic moving over to the Knicks, did the Knicks for the last 3 years. And, you know, as of the time we're recording this, I'm very shortly into, you know, being one of the national writers for The Athletic.
What you said about being laid off is so funny and hits home and is so true because I literally same thing got laid off last year actually by Bleacher Report too, and it was the same. It was like the same thing. It was like your landlord doesn't, you can't. It's part of the journey. Like it's I work in sports media. Like they don't, they don't care that it happens to all of us all the time, and that's definitely been I think something that not only myself but any of my other younger contemporaries in the business have learned very quickly once you get out of school is how treacherous and how how many roadblocks are there to sort of you really committing to want to do this and to want to stay in it. So that's kind of where my next question goes is you know at those times when you have gotten laid off and you have been told like okay there's not space for you here or we're prioritizing this person or whatever, what has it been for you that's kept you going to get to the next step? Because at the end of the day, you look at yourself, you look at anybody in our business that does well. The common trait I've found in a lot of you is that you just don't give up. So what has been for you? What has been that fire that's kept you going?
I tell this to, I often get like students who hit me up, high school, college, whatever. And I always try to respond if I can, because I used to do that when I was in high school and college. And there were a lot of writers who were incredibly kind and responded and took the time to talk to me and whatever. I feel like I have to pay it back. Not have to pay it back. I want to pay it back. And I like talking to students and I'll tell them there is only one perk to doing this job. Like it's not actually as glorious as a lot of people think. People think I'm like, don't get me wrong, it's awesome, but it's not glorious. You know, I'm spending a lot of time grinding. And there's only one perk to this job because I don't get weekends. I don't get holidays. I don't get confined work hours. If news breaks at 2 a.m., I got to be on it. And if I'm not on it, people are like, why are you not on it? I could get a call at 11 p.m. from someone important and I got to take it. There's no work life boundary. You're missing a lot of your friends' weddings. You are making the salary of a journalist, which the vast majority of us are not Stephen A. Smith. If the salary of a journalist was Stephen A. Smith, great. Maybe it's worth it. But a lot of us are not. The salary of a journalist is a low number. You're not getting great benefits. There is one perk to the job. And the perk to the job is that you love the job. You are just obsessed with the job. And if you're not absolutely head over heels in love with the job, if you don't feel like it's completely your calling, then it's probably not for you. Because why would you make all those sacrifices if you don't even love it? You know? And there are some people who I see who I think are much more talented than me, better reporters, better writers, better, like anything you could name that you want in a reporter, just better. But they're not obsessed. They're not totally and completely in love. And that's not a fault on them. Like, you can't, just because you're not totally and completely obsessed with the same thing I do, like for me, it's like a flaw. Like, I've ruined my life in order to do this. You know, I have decided that this is the most important thing to me, and I have to pursue this and be as good as I can at this. And I will never forgive myself if I don't. Other people have lives, they have families. Can you imagine the horror of choosing your children over this? You know? So they choose those things. And eventually, those people end up being like, it's not worth it anymore. Or the job starts to grind on them. They start to resent it and it affects their work. And even though they're such great writers and or such great reporters, such great storytellers, still good on TV, whatever else, they just, their work quality ends up being diminished because that passion is not there to get them kind of over the goal line. And I find that if you love it, and loving it, by the way, is not just loving, like, if you just love going to games and interviewing players and being at MSG during an awesome, intense Knicks Heat game, it's not enough. Like, I'll use a JJ Redick line where JJ Redick talks about how you have to fall in love with the grind. Like, I'll say 10 to 20% of this job is like the cool stuff. Is the going to games, is the interviewing players, is the getting to ask Tom Thibodeau whatever you want. And then the rest of it is the grind. The rest of it is putting in phone calls, staying on top of the ball, traveling to places when you're unbelievably exhausted, getting on an airplane at 6 a.m. the night after a game so you can get to the next location after a back-to-back, and then having to write and stay up late and work until 1 a.m. that next morning because the second night of a back-to-back game went into overtime, and you're staying at a hotel that has an infestation in the room, but you don't have time to go to the front desk because you're still writing and you're prioritizing your work over the infestation. And you're like, you know what, I'll deal with the bug bites. That's a real thing that happened to me. That is actually not a made-up thing. That happened to me at a hotel in Houston once. But it's like, it is that. And if you love the grind, it's all worth it. But you got to love the grind.
Absolutely. Appreciate the perspective there. I think that's really important for all the high school and the college and the post grads out there that are thinking about wanting to do this or early and wanting to do it is to hear the reality of the job and to hear the pros and the cons of it. Because I think that's something, especially when you start out and you are just like I was, and just like you were when you were young, when you were in high school and college or whatever, and you're going to a lot of these people for advice and stuff, just because of time and stuff, and you know it better than anybody in the job you have. Like, you can only share so much, and it's hard to get that full. Okay, let me sit you down and like tell you. Okay, 10 to 20% of this job is the stuff that you see me on the court and you see me in the press conference and you see me on NBA TV every so often and whatever, and but that is this much of it, and you really need to be enamored with the other parts of it. I mean, just in terms of advice that you would give people in those positions, and they say, okay, I'm committed to this. I love doing this. I've done it for my college paper. I've interned at XYZ. I want to do this. For those that are that committed and really want to chase this, what is your best piece of advice that you give those people when you talk to them?
Stay determined. Don't become undeterred. I have been rejected from, I cannot tell you how many jobs I've been rejected from. I cannot tell you how many jobs have failed to get back to me. I cannot tell you how many jobs have spoken to me and then been like, nah. It is, especially if I include the stuff when I was coming out of college, it's got to be in the triple digits. Like it's got to be. You got to just deal with the rejection and believe in yourself, and just be hypercritical of yourself, even as you believe in yourself. I was a terrible writer. You know the reason I didn't get those jobs out of college? Because I was applying for writing jobs and I was a terrible writer. It's a really good reason for someone not to get a writing job. I couldn't be like, damn, that's bullshit. I'm not getting these jobs for writing when I can't write. Now, I think I thought I could write at the time, and I look back on it. I looked back on it even a couple of years later. And a couple of years later, by the way, looking back on that, I would say I was a bad writer. But a couple of years later, I was like, ooh, I could not write. It was just cringeworthy. And now it is so cringeworthy looking at some of the stuff that I was writing back then. It's just, I just wasn't good at it. But if you love it, it should be easy to outwork everybody. And you find what you love and you do the work in that. And there are a lot of lanes that you can carve out in media. For all the talk of how nobody knows how to make money in this industry anymore, which is not fake, and how it's becoming a lot more difficult to become a reporter, and AI is going to take all of our jobs and all those sorts of things. And those are all legitimate topics to discuss. What I would say is there's another side to it, which is I think it's more of a meritocracy now than it used to be. Whereas you used to have to go to the small market, work your way up, get discovered, get exposure. Something that people talked about to me when I switched, and this is just like friends, family, whatever. When I switched from the Wizards to the Knicks, people said to me, oh, it'd be great for exposure. And I was like, I don't really think I buy that anymore. Like, it's the age of the internet, it's the age of social media. Anyone who could potentially hire me is going to see my stuff if I write something really good. It's just the way it tends to work. And it becomes more of a meritocracy. And as opposed to people going off of your CV, they might be more likely to go off of, oh, I remember that guy wrote that thing and I didn't even care about that topic, but I read it. It was really good. You have more of a reach. And if you continue to do good work, you continue to write, you continue to work hard. I think that's important. I think finding writers who you like and admire and reading them constantly really helps. I think reading is as important to getting better at writing as writing is. And also just writing all the time. I know there are some people who don't have the ability to do it, whether because they, don't want to give away their work for free, and I understand that, or whatever else. But if you don't want to give away your work for free and you're home and you got 30 minutes to kill, write a journal entry. Then go back in a week, read that journal entry, structure that journal entry as if it's a story on anything. It doesn't have to be about sports, whatever you want to write about. Write it like a story, and then go back and reread it and edit it and be like, oh, I could have done this. Because time away from your stories, even if you haven't gotten better, time away from your stories can give you a much better perspective. I find doing that kind of stuff, just competing with yourself all the time is a really good thing to do. And you kind of have to maintain that balance between confidence in yourself and believing in yourself while also being your greatest critic.
One of the last things that I want to ask you, Fred, you've been really gracious with your time and we greatly appreciate it. is once you've gotten to the stage where you are in one of these jobs, whether it's at, you're covering high school sports, you're covering college sports, you're covering pro sports, you're a sports writer, you're a sports reporter. One of the most important parts of the job, of course, is the relationship aspect of building those connections with players, with coaches, so that you can get information you need, so that you can tell good feature stories and you can be that much better at your job. And I know when I was coming up, that's one thing that I really tried to ask people like yourself, which is just how do you go about building those relationships? I know for me, like I was in NBA locker rooms when I was like 18, and I was like, it's just hard. Like when you're in college or you're in high school and you're in those spots for the first time, which I think a lot of people watching this will be those kinds of people. From that stage all the way through your jobs that you have as you progress in the business, how do you build relationships the right way and earn that trust of these players and these coaches that, like, okay, that's somebody that's taking their job seriously that I can, lend information to and build trust with?
So I'll give a few answers to that. The first one is I think it's really important to refine your craft before you go into the spotlight. So, like, for example, when I was in college, I worked at the NBC affiliate. I went to Mizzou. I worked at the NBC affiliate in Columbia, Missouri. I worked at the NPR affiliate in Columbia, Missouri. I did a terrible job at the NPR affiliate in Columbia, Missouri. I think they hated me. I did an awful job there. I don't work in radio. Not a coincidence. I did an awful job for them. I wrote for a number of blogs. I covered the basketball team. I covered the men's and women's basketball team. I did play-by-play for them. I did play-by-play in the Cape Cod League, which is a baseball league and one of the best summer leagues for college baseball players. I covered the volleyball team. I was a beat writer for the baseball team, and just get your reps in. You want to get your reps in, and that helps in terms of building relationships, because when you're doing that in college or you're doing it just out of college, look, you don't need to go to a small market paper and start covering prep sports or whatever else. You don't need to do that now. However, it's really helpful. It is like really, really helpful. And if you do that, because a lot of people, especially people from big cities, like I'm from New York, and when I, went to Missouri for college, people are like, "Why are you going there?" I was like, it's a great journalism school, but no one from New York goes to Mizzou. When I moved to Oklahoma, to Norman, Oklahoma, to write for the paper in Norman, Oklahoma, people are like, "What are you doing? You work in New York, you live in New York, you're from New York, you've been covering the NBA. What are you doing?" A lot of people from the bigger cities just think it's insane to move to places like this to get your reps in. And if you're willing to do that and you get your reps in, even when I was in Norman and I was covering the Thunder, I was still going and covering high school sports at times. I was covering high school tennis. Like it was like a thing. I'd do high school tennis, and I would write these high school tennis stories every summer when it wasn't basketball season anymore. And you get your reps in and you learn how to deal with people as a reporter. And dealing with people is no different whether you're covering the NBA or you're covering high school tennis. It's still dealing with people. And it's something that you recognize when you kind of start smaller and you move your way up. So you can build those people skills. When I talk to Josh Hart or I talk to Jalen Brunson, I'm not thinking about them as NBA stars. That's just not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking of them as people who I know and who I have to cover fairly. And when they play poorly, I'll write about how they play poorly. And when they play well, I'll write about how they play well. And when I get an anecdote about them that's interesting, then I'll write that. And I think ultimately building those people skills and building that up is a really, really important part of the job. I think having a natural curiosity is something that can really help you. It's something that's helped me. I'm just so interested in the subject, so interested in the topic. I think sometimes I ask questions and people are like, "Oh, I've never been asked that before." And when you're just in there and you're kind of asking every day, like, "So how'd you feel going up for that shot?" then people get bored hearing that same question over and over again from different reporters, and you kind of get lost in the sauce, and people don't really pick you out. But when you really do your homework and you come and you ask smart, specific, intelligent questions, sometimes you'll piss people off, and sometimes you'll impress people. What I find is if you maintain that demeanor, which can be hard, you maintain that work ethic, you maintain like being prepared for everything, you maintain that knowledge, and you also maintain a sort of humility of like, hey, I cover Tom Thibodeau and I think I know a lot about basketball, but that man has forgotten more about basketball in a day than what is it? He's forgotten more about basketball in a day than I'll ever know. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
forgotten more about, you maintain that humility. Like, I can learn this. And you kind of just use the job as a way to learn, whether that's learning about the game, learning about people, learning about the inner workings of an organization, whatever else. You're constantly asking these questions and trying to learn. Like, you can, people will start to respect that. The other thing that I will say is find your voice. And people will tell you that all the time as a writer. And that's obviously very good advice as a writer. You want to find your voice. I think it's also true as a behind the scenes reporter. You want to find your voice. What works for me is that I absolutely love basketball. I just love it. And don't tell my employer this, but I do it for free. Like, I would do this for free. Like, if we lived in a society where money didn't exist and we all just kind of got the same stuff, and like, we lived in like The Giver and we all just got the same stuff, and I just had to occupy my time. Like, if I got fired in a couple weeks, you know what I would do? I would like stay at home to watch the Kings game. I would, this is what I would be doing. And so what works for me is that I love the game and I try to be incredibly honest with everybody. You don't want to be two-faced. I think people ask me all the time, like, what do you do when a player gets pissed at you for writing something negative? I find that for the most part, players don't get pissed if you write something negative. Players get pissed if you write something negative and it shocks them, or they feel like you were two-faced, or they feel like you kind of did them dirty. And if you're upfront with the people you cover, if you're willing to go to them and be like, hey, I'm writing this thing about how you're not shooting well. I want to get your perspective so I can throw it in. What's going on with the jumper? I noticed that the elbow's been a little off here. Is that correct? You're shooting this percentage from this spot since this date. Any correlation there? They might not like it, but you'll come in the next day, and for the most part, everything will be fine. I very rarely have problems with writing things that are unflattering about people because I think they know that I'm fair and that I'm not trying to be a jerk. And I think sometimes when you're going to be a jerk sometimes because none of us are perfect. Sometimes when I'm a jerk, I'll have a player pull me over and be like, Fred, you're being kind of a dick. I'll be like, ah, shit, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be a dick, but I'm just trying to get this answer, and it's nice to be able to have that sort of rapport, and you can gain that sort of mutual respect, but it starts with a respect of those people, with meeting them on their level, especially once you get to the NBA level. There's so many players who just like everyone wants something from them. You know, they just come across so many people in their lives where so many people want something from them. And they very understandably, a lot of players will kind of grow this harder outer shell where they're like, they just kind of assume someone who's approaching them wants something from them. But I don't want anything from them. And I think you have to show them that. Just be like, no, we're meeting each other on the same ground. I'm a person, you're a person. We're gonna talk. We're gonna get to know each other. Most of the time I talk to guys in interviews, it's just like shooting the shit about, the Jets game, or asking how their kids are, or talking about stand-up comedy or music or whatever else, like it's that kind of stuff. And so you want to build those relationships and get to know people. And, and then once people trust you, and they know how you operate, then they will give you information because they understand that you'll handle it responsibly and with respect.
Fred, obviously doing great work for The Athletic. I know you also host the Katz and Shoot podcast. Where can people find your work?
Yeah, so you can read all my stuff at The Athletic. You can follow me on Twitter at Fred Katz, Katz. You can subscribe to my podcast, Knicks and NBA podcast. Now I'm losing my voice. Sorry, dealing with a cold. You can follow my podcast or subscribe to my podcast, Katz and Shoot, like you said. That's a subscription pod. It's on the Knicks and the NBA. Patreon.com/Katz and Shoot. That's my last name, Katz and Shoot. And yeah, that's it. A lot of stuff coming up.
Amazing. Fred, thank you so much for your time and for all of the nuggets that you gave us in this interview. It was great.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yep, absolutely. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for tuning into another episode of University of Hoops, the show that's taking you behind the scenes of your favorite basketball teams every single week with great interviews just like this one. Stay tuned because we'll be back next week with another show.